On the night of December 20th, 1987, a passenger ferry named Doña Paz was sailing north through the warm waters of the central Philippines. The sea was calm. The sky was clear. It was 5 days before Christmas. On her decks were thousands of people heading home for the holiday. Migrant workers, students, families with infants. The official passenger list said 1,493. Almost nobody on board believed that number was real. Some hours earlier, a small oil tanker called the Vector had left a refinery on the other side of the country, carrying more than 8,000 barrels of gasoline. She was bound for an island to the south. On her bridge that night, there was no captain, no officer of the watch, no lookout. The two ships were moving on opposite courses, into the same narrow strait. At around 10:30 in the evening, in clear weather and on a quiet sea, they ran straight into each other. The Vector exploded on impact. Burning gasoline spilled across the water. Within minutes, the ocean itself was on fire. On the Doña Paz, passengers woke up to flames. No distress signal was ever sent. By the time the world found out, 8 hours later, only 24 people were left alive from the ferry. The dead were estimated at more than 4,300. This is the story of the worst peacetime sea disaster in history, and why you have probably never heard of it. The Doña Paz did not start her life in the Philippines. She was built in 1963 at the Onomichi shipyard in southern Japan, as a small domestic passenger ship for the inland sea. Her original name was Himiyori Maru. In 1975 she was sold to a Philippine shipping company called Sulpisayo Lines, refitted for tropical service, and renamed Don Sulpisayo. 4 years later, in 1979, she caught fire at sea. The fire was contained. No one died. By any reasonable standard, she should have been scrapped. Instead, she was refurbished again, repainted, and given a new name. Doña Paz. Lady Peace. From 1981 onward, she ran one of the busiest ferry routes in the country, from the eastern islands of Leyte and Samar, around the southern tip of Luzon, to the great port of Manila. In the Philippines of the 1980s, that route was a lifeline. Hundreds of thousands of people from the eastern provinces worked or studied in Manila, and the cheapest way home for Christmas was a deck-class ticket on a Sulpicio ferry. The trip took about 24 hours. A deck-class ticket did not promise you a bed. It did not promise you a seat. It promised you a square of floor, somewhere on the ship, that you could call your own for the night. Families brought blankets, bamboo mats, and food. Children slept in their mother's arms. The official capacity of the Doña Paz after her Philippine refit was around 1,400 passengers. In the week before Christmas, no one was counting that closely. Tickets were sold by hand, often without a passenger list. Infants and small children did not require tickets at all. On the morning of December 20th, the Doña Paz left the port of Tacloban on the island of Leyte. She stopped briefly at Catbialogan on Samar to take on more passengers. By the time she pulled away from her last stop, she was, by every honest estimate, carrying somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people. Around the same hours, on the other side of Luzon, a small oil tanker was getting ready to sail. Her name was MT Vector. She was 629 gross tons of welded steel, owned by a company called Vector Shipping Corporation. The Vector had been chartered to carry petroleum products for Caltex Philippines, a subsidiary of the American oil giant. On that trip her tanks held about 8,800 barrels of gasoline, diesel, and naphtha. She was headed from the Batachan refinery to the island of Masbate. That was the story on paper. The reality of the Vector, as investigators would later piece together, was harder to believe. Her certificate of inspection had expired. Her permit to carry dangerous cargo was missing required signatures. Several of her officers, including her captain, did not hold valid licenses. She had no functioning lookout system. There were not enough qualified watch officers on board to keep continuous watches. On the night she set out, the small crew on duty was, in essence, letting the ship steer herself. In maritime law, that condition has a name. The ship was unseaworthy. By the time she entered Tablas Strait that evening, she was a 1,000-ton tank of gasoline moving through the busiest ferry corridor in the central Philippines, with effectively no one in command. Tablas Strait is a stretch of water between the islands of Marinduque and Mindanao, north of the Visayan Sea. On any given night in the 1980s, dozens of inter-island ships crossed it. It was not a remote ocean. It was a highway. By 10 o'clock that evening, the Doña Paz was running north up the strait at about 16 knots. Most of the passengers were already asleep. The few who were awake on the upper decks remembered later that the sea was unusually calm, almost glassy, with a soft warm wind. The Vector was running south, on roughly the opposite course. Her speed was perhaps 8 or 10 knots. Their combined closing speed was close to 30 miles an hour. Each ship would later be reported as visible to the other from miles away. There is no clean record of what was happening on the Doña Paz bridge in those last minutes. Survivors said the captain, Eusebio Reno, was not on the bridge. They said the watch crew was drinking beer and watching television. Whatever the truth, no one on the ferry sounded an alarm. On the Vector, there was, by all accounts, simply nobody watching at all. The two ships, sailing on a transparent night, in clear weather, on a calm sea, with thousands of lives between them, ran together at full speed. The Vector struck the Doña Paz on her starboard side, slightly forward of midship. The Vector's hull split. Her tanks ruptured. Gasoline sprayed out and ignited almost instantly, in a fireball that lit the strait for miles. The burning fuel poured into the gash in the ferry side, and onto the water around her. In less than a minute, the sea was on fire. The Doña Paz herself began to burn from the inside. Imagine, for a moment, the inside of that ship. Long corridors packed with sleeping families. Stairwells stacked with bedrolls. Cargo holds where men had bedded down on top of crates of fruit. Everything wooden. Everything painted with cheap flammable paint. Everything full of people. The flames moved through the space the way fire moves through dry grass. People woke up to smoke, then to heat, then to fire walking down the passageway. Many of them were trapped before they were fully awake. Survivors later told the same story, in different words. The lights went out. Doors jammed. Children disappeared in the dark. Some of them said the cabinets containing the life jackets had been locked, and that the keys could not be found. Investigators have disputed that detail, but they have not disputed the panic. The Doña Paz was burning above the waterline. The sea around her was burning at the waterline. To escape the fire on the ship, you had to jump into a sea that was on fire. There were no good choices. Some people jumped anyway. The few who survived the night were those who jumped early enough, and far enough, to reach water that the burning gasoline had not yet covered. They burned their hands diving past the oily flames on the surface. No SOS was ever broadcast from the Doña Paz. The ship's radio room may have been destroyed in the collision. Whoever was on watch may have been killed instantly. Whatever the reason, the world did not know. Within about 2 hours, both ships had slipped beneath the surface of Tablas Strait. The fire on the water kept burning. Around it, in the dark, the survivors floated in patches of oil, listening for engines that did not come. This is the detail that, decades later, still makes investigators uncomfortable. From the moment the two ships collided, until the moment any search and rescue authority knew that anything had happened, more than 8 hours passed. There were no satellites watching this part of the sea. There was no automated identification system on small Philippine ferries in 1987. There was no overdue alert because the Doña Paz was not yet due in Manila. From above, the night looked normal. In the water, it was not normal. Survivors held onto floating debris, breathing fumes from the gasoline. Some had been badly burned. Sharks were drawn by the smell of blood and fuel. Some of those who had made it off the ship did not survive the wait. At dawn, another Philippine ship, the MV Don Claudio, was crossing the same strait on her own route. Her watch saw bodies in the water. Then they saw movement. Then they began pulling people out. It was only then that the news traveled from the strait to the Philippine Coast Guard. Helicopters launched. Other ships diverted. Search teams started combing the strait. By that point, most of those who could still be saved had already been pulled out by Don Claudio. The final count from the water was small enough to be written by hand. 24 people from the Doña Paz. 2 people from the Vector. That second number told its own story. 2 crew was all the Vector had had on deck, in any meaningful sense, when she put thousands of lives at risk. In the first official reports, the death toll from the Doña Paz was given as 1,500. That was the manifest figure, with a few additions for crew. Within days, the families of the missing began to call the company, the newspapers, the church. The phone calls kept coming. Whole families were missing. A man who had bought 4 tickets had brought 7 children. A grandmother had brought 2 grandchildren on a single fare. A village in Samar had sent 11 young men. None of them were on the list. None of them came home. A Filipino human rights lawyer named Pablito Sanedad began gathering families together. He took down names, ages, photographs, last known seats on the ship. Other lawyers and journalists in Tacloban and Manila did the same. Slowly, over years, they assembled a count that the manifest had never tried to keep. The number they arrived at, and that most independent sources have used ever since, is around 4,386 dead. With the 24 survivors, that means the Doña Paz had been carrying more than 4,400 people that night. That figure is roughly 3 times the death toll of the Titanic. It is more than the death toll of the Lusitania. It makes the Doña Paz, by every serious accounting, the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in human history. You almost certainly knew the names Titanic and Lusitania before you knew the name Doña Paz. There are reasons for that, and we will come to them. But first, there was a courtroom. The legal case took 12 years to grind through the Philippine system. The central question was simple: who paid? The family sued Sulpicio Lines, which owned the ferry. Sulpicio sued Vector Shipping, which owned the tanker. Vector sued Caltex, which had chartered the tanker. In 1999, the Supreme Court of the Philippines delivered its ruling. The Vector and her owners, the court found, were primarily responsible. The tanker had been unseaworthy. Her crew had been unqualified. Her watch had been absent. Caltex, as the charterer, was not liable for what its contractor did with the ship. Sulpicio Lines was also found at fault for failing to ensure that its own watch was properly kept that night, and for the unspeakable failure to know how many people were on the ship. The compensation to each family came out to around 250,000 pesos. At the exchange rate of the time, that was roughly $5,000. For a parent. For a child. For an entire household lost in one fire on the sea. Sulpicio Lines kept running ferries. In 1988, the year after the Doña Paz, another of its ships, the Doña Marilyn, went down in a typhoon, killing more than 200. In 2008, its Princess of the Stars capsized in another typhoon, killing more than 800. After Princess of the Stars, the company was forced to suspend operations and rebrand. It is no longer called Sulpicio Lines. The pattern, though, was not really about one company. It was about a whole system of ferries that ran on cheap tickets, low margins, and almost no accounting of who was on board. Doña Paz happened 5 days before Christmas, in a country that was still emerging from political upheaval. The People Power Revolution had ousted Ferdinand Marcos less than 2 years earlier. Newspapers were full of coups, inflation, and rebellions. A ferry sinking in a strait did not stay on the front page. Most of the dead were poor. They were domestic workers, farm laborers, students from rural Samar and Leyte. They did not travel with passports. They were not insured. Their names were not on a wire service list that ran in New York and London the next morning. The Titanic took down millionaires and a famous journalist along with the rest. The Doña Paz took down a village school's worth of children with their grandmothers, in a sea their families could not reach. The world's memory is not neutral. It tracks fame and money. The Doña Paz had neither. There is also, perhaps, a deeper silence. To remember the Doña Paz is to admit how easy it was. A ferry sold too many tickets. A tanker had nobody on the bridge. A coast guard had no way to know. None of it required a storm, or a war, or iceberg. It required only a normal night. Today, the wreck of the Doña Paz lies in around 500 meters of water, somewhere south of the island of Marinduque. She has never been raised. She has never been formally surveyed. The Philippine government has declared the site a maritime grave. In Tacloban, families still hold a mass on the 20th of December each year. They read names. They light candles. The list of names they read is longer than the list the company kept that night. Of the 24 people who came out of the water that morning, several have spoken publicly over the years. They have described smoke, fire, water, sharks, and a silence afterwards that the rest of us are still trying to fill. There is no single villain in this story. There is a tanker company that should not have been in business. A ferry company that did not count its passengers. A coast guard that could not see in the dark. A government that did not regulate. A culture of casual overloading, sustained by everyone who bought a cheap ticket and looked the other way. If there is a moral, It is one that maritime safety inspectors have been repeating for 150 years and that we keep needing to learn again. Most disasters at sea are not freak accidents. They are the predictable consequence of small, ordinary choices, multiplied by water. More than 4,000 people stepped onto a ferry that should not have sailed, crossed paths with a tanker that should not have been there, and met a fire that should have been impossible. It happened in clear weather, on a calm sea, 5 days before Christmas. The deadliest peacetime sea disaster in human history did not make the front page of the world's newspapers, and it has not, in the decades since, found its way into the popular memory of disasters. Perhaps it is time it did. In the next episode, we'll travel to another sea, in another year, where another ship full of people went down in conditions even harder to imagine, and where the silence afterwards lasted not for hours, but for half a century. Subscribe so you don't miss it.